By 9 that morning, Ellie Whitaker had already buried her husband, emptied her savings, and watched a landlord throw her children's last safe place onto a San Francisco sidewalk. The landlord stood above her on the steps of 412 Columbus Avenue, smiling while her suitcases hit the sidewalk one by one. Her 6-year-old daughter, Grace, clutched a cloth doll against her chest with both arms. Her 9-year-old son, Tommy, carried a cardboard box that was too heavy for him, a box of his father's things from the docks, and his jaw was set in the way of a boy who has decided not to cry in front of strangers. Walter Hargrove descended the steps slowly, the way men do when they own the building and everyone on the sidewalk knows it. He had rings on 2 fingers and a tan that came from standing in the sun while other people worked. He looked at Ellie the way a man looks at a number that doesn't balance. "Widows don't get special treatment in my building," he said, loud enough for the neighbors in the windows to hear. "And children don't make rent appear." Ellie did not flinch. She kept her voice level and her eyes dry. "I am 2 weeks short. I have a job. I will have it by Friday." "You've been 2 weeks short for 3 months, Hargrove said. He turned to Eddie Malloy, the superintendent, who was standing beside the suitcases with the expression of a man being slowly buried alive. "The box too, Eddie." Eddie hesitated. "The box," Hargrove repeated. Eddie picked up Daniel Whitaker's box of dock tools and work papers and set to it on the sidewalk beside the suitcases. Tommy moved toward it immediately, both hands out. Hargrove stepped close enough that the boy had to stop. "That's your father's things," Tommy said. "Everything in that apartment belongs to me until the rent is settled," Hargrove said pleasantly. "Then your father should have left you rent money instead of memories." Grace tugged her mother's coat. In a small, serious voice, she asked, "Mommy, are we going to sleep outside?" Hargrove glanced at her without changing expression. "That depends on your mother's choices, not mine." Ellie pulled Grace against her leg and said nothing. There was nothing left to say to a man like that. Poverty had made Ellie quiet. It had not made her weak. From the second-floor window, Mrs. Rosalie Bennett leaned out with her white hair loose and her voice raised. "Eleanor, come back up, honey. He cannot do this. I have your receipts." "Stay inside, Rosalie," Hargrove said, in the tone of a man addressing a piece of furniture. "This is business." A small crowd had gathered. The produce man across the way stood with a crate in his arms. 2 women from the Italian bakery watched from the doorway. 3 men from the auto shop 2 doors down had come out without their coats. Hargrove had arranged it this way. He always made these things public. He believed in giving examples. Tommy looked across the street. The diner on the corner was called the Harbor Bell, and its neon sign was the kind of blue that comes from a bulb that has been dying for weeks. Through the window of the last booth, Tommy could see a man in a low cap and a dark green jacket, a cup of coffee in front of him, very still. The recognition came slowly, then all at once. Tommy turned to his mother and said, quietly but clearly, "Mom, that's Steve McQueen." Hargrove heard it. He looked across the street. He looked at the man in the prop booth. Then he looked back at Tommy and let out a short, practiced laugh, the kind designed to make a child feel foolish. "Movie heroes don't pay rent, kid," he said. "They only pretend to save people." Steve had heard men insult grown men before. He had done the same himself, in other times, other moods. But there was something different about hearing a rich man aim cruelty at a 9-year-old boy trying not to cry on a public sidewalk in the December cold. He set his coffee down. He stood. He left $3 on the table without counting it and walked out. He crossed Columbus Avenue without hurrying, hands in his jacket pockets, and stepped onto the sidewalk where the Whitaker family stood beside their bags and their father's box in the December cold. He did not announce himself. He did not look for attention. He looked at Grace first, then at Tommy, then at Ellie, who met his eyes with an expression that said, "I don't know if this helps or makes it worse, and I don't have energy left to find out." Then he looked at Hargrove. "How much does she owe?" he said. Hargrove smiled the smile he used for people he considered beneath a real response. "Mr. McQueen, I appreciate the dramatic entrance, but this is a private matter between a tenant and her landlord." "How much?" Steve said again. The same tone, the same volume, just the words, again, with the specific patience of a man who is not asking twice for the Answer only for the number. Hargrove looked at him for one long moment. Then he decided to enjoy this. 6 weeks back rent, late fees, processing fee for the eviction notice, damages to the unit she never reported. He paused. Comes to $460. Ellie's jaw tightened. There are no damages. I painted that apartment myself. I have receipts. I have a different set of receipts, Hargrove said pleasantly. Steve reached into his jacket. He did not look at Hargrove while he counted. He looked at the children. He counted to $500 and held the bills out. Ellie moved first. I don't know how to take this from you, she said quietly. Not aggressive. Just honest, in the way of a woman who has had to be careful about what she accepts from people she doesn't know. Then don't take it as charity, Steve said. Take it as time. Hargrove reached for the money. Steve pulled his hand back an inch. Bags first, Steve said. The smile on Hargrove's face changed shape. Excuse me? Her bags go upstairs. Her father's box goes upstairs. Then, you get the money. 1. Silence on the sidewalk. The produce man was no longer pretending to work. Mrs. Bennett had both hands over her mouth. Hargrove said, You think this is a movie, Mr. McQueen? No, Steve said. In a movie, the landlord would have something interesting to say. Tell Eddie to take the bags up. Hargrove's jaw worked once, the way a man's jaw works when he is chewing on something he would rather throw. He turned to Eddie Malloy. Take the bags up, Eddie, he said. Eddie picked up both suitcases without a word. He did not look at anyone. He went inside. All of them, Steve said. Eddie came back for the box of Daniel's things. Steve held the money out to Hargrove. Hargrove took it. He counted it with deliberate slowness, the performance of a man reminding the audience who actually controls the room. When he was done, he folded the bills and put them in his chest pocket. That covers the balance, he said. Doesn't cover what's coming. We'll do 6 months, Steve said. He was already reaching into his jacket. Again, Hargrove blinked. It was the first unguarded thing his face had done. 6 months is $1,800, he said. He named the number like a wall, expecting it to stop things. Steve counted it out. He held it out, and he did not blink, and he did not move, and the cold December air on Columbus Avenue was very, very quiet. Buying applause, Mr. McQueen? Hargrove said. Steve said, No, I'm buying her time. That's more than you were willing to give. He handed over the money. He watched Ellie take the children inside. He watched Hargrove fold the bills into his chest pocket with a deliberateness that communicated, clearly, that this was not the end of anything. Enjoy your movie, Hargrove said, and walked inside after them. Steve stood on the sidewalk alone. He felt the specific, quiet satisfaction of a right thing done, and underneath it, already, the warning that right things done in the wrong man's presence tend to have consequences. Walter Hargrove had just been publicly humiliated in front of 20 people. He had not gone angry. He had gone methodical. By sunrise, Eleanor Whitaker no longer had a rent problem. She had a custody problem. Eleanor Whitaker had been holding things together since October, and holding things together is exhausting in a way that doesn't show from the outside. It shows in other ways. In the way she checked the lock 3 times before bed. In the way she counted the coins in her tip jar with the lights off, because Tommy slept in the next room, and she didn't want him to hear the sound of her arithmetic. In the way she worked the morning shift Tuesday, Wednesday, and every Saturday, and the night shift Thursday and Friday, and smiled at the counter customers the way people smile when their faces, the last professional tool they have left. Daniel Whitaker had died on a Tuesday in October. He had been working the cargo dock at the bay when a pallet shifted, and the bay is cold enough in October that by the time they pulled him out, the cold had already finished what the pallet started. He had been 35 years old. He had worked the docks for 11 years. He had fixed things in the apartment himself. Because he didn't want to bother Eddie Malloy, he had never complained about anything in his life that Ellie could remember, which was the kind of fact that hit her at odd hours, not when she expected it, but while she was washing a cup or folding a shirt. He left hospital bills, dock company paperwork, and a sealed envelope. Ellie, open this when you're ready. No rush. D. She was not ready. After the sidewalk, after Steve McQueen had paid 6 months of rent in cash, in front of 20 neighbors, and the shame and the relief had settled into something she could not name, Ellie came inside and locked the door and sat at the kitchen table and said nothing for a long time. Tommy brought her a glass of water without being asked. Grace sat beside her and leaned against her arm, still holding the doll. "Are we staying?" Grace asked. "Yes," Ellie said. "For now." She did not tell them it was because a movie star had paid for 6 months. She did not know how to explain that, or what it meant about the world, or what she was supposed to feel about it. Gratitude, yes, but also something that sat beside the gratitude and was harder to look at, the particular discomfort of needing to be saved, of having 2 children and a dead husband, and a landlord who smiled while her father's tools hit the sidewalk, of standing in the cold with nothing in your hands that the law would recognize. As a defense, she had the receipts. She had 2 weeks of back rent, not 6. She had Daniel's original lease, signed in 1958, at a rent that had gone up twice since, but not as much as Hargrove claimed. She had her own records of every payment made. Hargrove's numbers were wrong, and she knew they were wrong, and it did not matter, because a woman with a waitress salary and 2 children in December is not in a position to take a landlord to court. She thought about Daniel's letter. She left it in the drawer. Not yet. What she did instead was go to work the next morning. She served coffee and eggs and smiled at the counter and moved between the tables with the efficiency of someone who cannot afford to stop moving. When Steve McQueen came in and sat in the window booth, she took his order with the level professional courtesy of a woman who knows who he is grateful, and intends to make nothing of either of those things. She served him coffee. She refilled it without asking. She did not mention the sidewalk. That was how she operated, not because she was cold, because she was holding everything together with both hands, and she could not afford to look down. She had also spent the evening before going through every receipt she owned. Daniel had kept a ledger, a small green notebook in the kitchen drawer beneath, to the menus, where he had recorded every rent payment made since 1958 with the date and the amount and the check number. It was not the kind of thing that held up in court on its own, but beside Hargrove's inflated figures, it told a clear story. The numbers were wrong. Not by accident, by design. She thought about telling someone. She thought about who there was to tell. She thought about the envelope in the drawer. Not yet. She went to work instead. Poverty had made Ellie quiet. It had not made her. Still, she was already thinking about what she could prove and who might listen. And the answer she kept arriving at was that she needed more than her own records. She needed someone who knew the building, someone who had watched what Hargrove was doing from the inside. She had a feeling she knew who that was. She had seen Eddie Malloy's face on the sidewalk the day the bags came down. He had not looked like a man carrying out orders he believed in. He had looked like a man being buried alive, slowly, by his own compliance. Ellie filed the thought and went to work, and the next morning she knocked on Eddie Malloy's door before her shift and asked him, directly, without accusation, whether any of the fees on her bill were ones he had been told to add by someone else. Eddie Malloy did not answer for a long moment. Then he said, "Come back when you're off shift. Bring your receipts." Walter Hargrove did not hate poor people. He hated poor people who kept records. He made the second phone call at 9 the next morning, from his office on Kearney Street, where the morning light came in through clean windows and the Plumrex filing cabinet against the wall contained 67 folders of paper he had spent 6 years preparing carefully. Charles Renner answered on the second ring. Renner was a man who wore expensive shoes and had the voice of someone who had never needed to raise it. He listened without interrupting. When Hargrove finished explaining what had happened on the sidewalk, there was a pause. "The McQueen problem will resolve itself," Renner said. "Actors have short attention spans. He'll be gone in a week. What matters is the building." The building at 412 Columbus Avenue had 17 units. 11 of them were occupied by long-term tenants paying below market rent. In the language Renner used, they were an inefficiency. In the language Renner did not use in public, they were the reason the building was worth half what it would be worth if it were empty. The plan had been running for 8 months. Manufactured violations, invented fees, lease amendments with altered language and signatures that were almost right. Most tenants, when faced with a landlord holding a document with their name on it, did not have the resources to prove the document was wrong. They paid, or they left. Eleanor Whitaker had been a target since spring. Since Daniel's death, she had become the easiest target in the building. A widow, a waitress, 2 children, grief that left her too tired to fight carefully. Hargrove had expected her gone by November. She was still there in December, and now Steve McQueen had bought her 6 months. The children, Hargrove said. What about them? Renner said. She works nights Thursday through Saturday. The children are alone from 9 to 2. A pause. That is a matter for social services, Renner said. Not for us. Of course, Hargrove said. We're just concerned citizens. He already knew which contact to call. A man in city administration who owed him a favor from a zoning dispute 4 years ago, the kind of favor that appreciates over time. Within 48 hours, a case file had been opened. The caseworker assigned was named Margaret Doyle. Hargrove had not chosen her specifically. He did not know her. He did not know that she was thorough, that she documented everything, and that she had developed, over 11 years in family services, a particular sensitivity to cases that arrived on her desk, already shaped by someone else's hands. That would matter later. Hargrove also did not know that this would be the last case he ever tried to use as a weapon. He poured himself a drink and thought about spring. The building would be empty. Renner's money would arrive. He would begin again, somewhere else. He had done it 4 times, in 4 neighborhoods, in 3 cities. Each time he had left before, the full weight of what he had done became visible to anyone with the standing to do something about it. He had never once been stopped. What Hargrove could not have planned for, what no man like him ever plans for, is that the people he underestimates keep paper too, that the widow at the end of her rope has a husband's letter in a kitchen drawer, that the veteran in apartment 108 has 12 years of receipts in a shoebox, that the retired schoolteacher in 214 has 27 years of correspondence in a filing cabinet. Hargrove did not know these things. He had decided that people without money were also without resources. He was about to learn the difference. The morning after Hargrove made his phone call, Margaret Doyle knocked on the door of apartment 7. She had a clipboard, a city ID, and the professionally neutral expression of a woman who has learned not to show which way she is leaning before she has finished leaning. She introduced herself as a family services caseworker. Ellie opened the door in her work clothes 40 minutes before her shift. She let her in. Doyle moved through the apartment with the unhurried efficiency of someone conducting a professional assessment. She asked about the kitchen, the food, the stove, the cleanliness. She asked about the children's bedrooms. She looked at the window in Tommy's room, which had a draft, and made a note. She asked about Ellie's work schedule, specifically the night shifts, and specifically who was with the children when Ellie was at the diner between 9 in the evening and 2 in the morning. Ellie answered every question directly. Mrs. Rosalie Bennett, apartment 214, had a key and checked on the children every evening. The children were asleep. They had never been left without someone reachable. Can Mrs. Bennett confirm that? Doyle asked. She has been doing it for 3 months, Ellie said. You can ask her. Doyle wrote something down. Then she looked up from her clipboard with the expression of a woman who is about to say something she has said before and does not enjoy saying. Mrs. Whitaker, I want to be transparent with you. If the complaint as filed is found to be substantiated, temporary removal of the children may need to be considered while the situation is reviewed. Ellie went very still. Not the still of a woman about to break, the still of a woman who has just understood the geometry of what is happening to her, who understands that this is not about her children's safety, because her children are safe, and the woman in front of her probably already suspects that, but the complaint exists, and the process has started, and the process does not stop because a process is process. Widow says she is doing her best. Temporary, Ellie said. While the situation is reviewed, Doyle repeated, it is not a determination. It is a possibility I am required by policy to disclose. Doyle left 20 minutes later. She paused at the door. I am not saying your children are unsafe, Mrs. Whitaker, she said, without turning around. I am saying someone has worked very hard to make it look That way. Then she left. Tommy came out of his room. He had heard. He stood in the hallway doorway with his arms at his sides, the expression of a boy who has been trying to be older than he is for 3 months and has just found the edge of how far that can take him. Grace appeared behind him. "Mommy," Grace said, in the small voice of a child asking a real question, "what does temporary mean?" Ellie looked at her daughter. She kept her voice steady, because she always kept her voice steady, because the children needed one person in the apartment who was steady, and she was the only one left. "It means something that doesn't last," she said. "Like winter." Tommy looked at the door. Then he put on his coat without a word and walked out. He should have left. That was the honest thing to admit. He had paid the money. He had watched the bags go back upstairs. He had done what the moment asked, and any reasonable accounting of it would have ended with him pointing his car south on Highway 1, toward Los Angeles. He stayed. He stayed because of the way Hargrove had taken the money, not with relief, not with the plain transaction of a man receiving what he's owed, but with the quiet satisfaction of a man filing something away for later. Steve had seen that expression before. He had seen it on men in reformatories when they learned something they intended to use. He checked out of his hotel and checked into a smaller one 3 blocks away, because 3 blocks was closer to the building. He watched the street from the diner window. He saw Ellie leave for her shift. On Tuesday, her posture straight and her steps efficient, the particular walk of someone who will not let herself slow down. He saw Tommy take Grace to school Wednesday morning, Tommy walking half a step ahead, Grace holding his sleeve. He was on his second cup Thursday morning, almost 11, when the boy appeared in the diner doorway. Tommy Whitaker. A coat a size too large, collar up, a wool cap the color of dead grass. He stood at the entrance with the particular stillness of a child who has made a decision that frightens him and has arrived at it anyway. He came to the booth. He sat down. He folded his hands on the table. "I need to ask you something," Tommy said. "Go ahead." Men in ties came to the apartment. He paused. "They asked about our mom. They asked if she left us alone at night. They wrote things down." Grace cried. Steve set down his cup. "What else did you hear?" "Through the wall. Something about a report. Something about the city." Tommy looked at him steadily. "Mom didn't do anything wrong. She leaves Mrs. Bennett a key. Mrs. Bennett checks on us. We're always asleep when she goes to work." "I know," Steve said. "My mom doesn't know I'm here. She'd tell me not to bother you." He looked at his hands, then back up. "Mr. McQueen, I think I made things worse." "How?" "By saying your name. On the sidewalk." His jaw was tight. "Mr. Hargrove, after you left, I heard him on the stairs. He was on the telephone. He sounded different than when he talks to the tenants. He sounded like he was planning something." Steve was quiet. Tommy said, "Can men in ties take children away from their mother, even when she didn't do anything wrong?" The question had the specific weight of a 9-year-old who has been thinking about something until he is more afraid of the answer than the question itself. Steve looked at the boy. "Not if I can help it," he said. Tommy nodded once, like a man receiving a fact he needed. He stood and straightened his coat. "Mr. McQueen," he said, "she has receipts. My mom has all her receipts. She keeps them in a folder in the kitchen drawer. Hargrove says she owes more than she does, and she knows it, but she doesn't know how to prove to it without a lawyer." He left. Steve watched him cross Columbus Avenue and disappear around the corner toward the building. Then he picked up his coffee and thought about Hargrove. He thought about the 2 phone calls a man like that makes after a public humiliation. He thought about what a landlord does when eviction is blocked. But the goal is still an empty building. He thought about social services and manufactured complaints and a mother who cannot fight custody and a fraud case at the same time with a waitress salary. He thought Hargrove did not just try to evict a widow. He created a 2-front war. Ellie could hold 1 front. She could not hold 2. Steve paid for his coffee. He walked to the building and knocked on the superintendent's door. Eddie Malloy answered in undershirt and suspenders, and his face when he saw Steve said everything. He had been expecting someone, and was not sure whether this was better or worse than who he'd imagined. He stepped back. Steve came inside. The apartment smelled of pipe tobacco and old wood, and the particular quiet of a man who lives alone and has learned to find it acceptable. There were photographs on the shelf by the radiator, A woman, younger, laughing, two boys, in baseball uniforms with sleeves too long. The photographs were not recent. Eddie poured coffee without asking. 9 years, Eddie said, when Steve asked how long he'd been superintendent. Hargroves had the building for 6 of them. And Renner? Eddie looked up from his cup. The name landed differently than Steve's had. I know that name, Steve said. Renner came around 8 months ago. Nice shoes. Stood in the lobby for 20 minutes and talked to Hargrove like they'd already decided something. After that, Hargrove got more serious about clearing people out. Who? Everyone who'd been here long, the ones on the old rates. He looked at the table. Mrs. Bennett in 214, 27 years Hargrove's been hitting her, with violations that don't exist, a crack in the hallway she didn't cause, a pipe she supposedly damaged. Samuel Ortiz in 108, veteran, hard of hearing, but sharp. Hargrove's been adding fees to his bill, calling them lease amendments. Are they in the lease? No. Hargrove made me sign things I never read, Eddie said. Then he stopped. He hadn't meant to say it. He looked at his cup. The words sat in the room. He had papers ready, Eddie continued, quieter. Told me they were standard. Building forms, maintenance authorization, access logs. I signed them because I needed the job. He paused. I think some of those papers were the lease. Amendments. I think my signature is on documents I never understood. Steve said nothing. I knew Daniel Whitaker, Eddie said. Good man. Worked the docks 11 years. Fixed things in the apartment himself so he wouldn't bother me. Never complained. About anything. He looked out the window. His wife came to see me 2 days ago. Eleanor. She knocked on my door before her morning shift, which means she knocked at 6:30 in the morning, and she stood in that doorway and asked me, directly and without accusation, whether any of the fees on her bill were ones she hadn't agreed to. What did you tell her? I told her to come back with her receipts. He paused. She did. She had. Every payment documented in a green notebook her husband had kept since 1958. Her numbers and Hargrove's numbers didn't match, and she knew they didn't match. And she just looked at me and asked me who had told me to add the February surcharge. He set his cup down carefully. I didn't answer. But she knew. She's been knowing for a while. Steve looked at him. Why didn't you tell her before? Eddie was quiet for a long time. I have a daughter, he said. 17. Lives with her mother in Oakland. Her school fees are not small. This job pays what it pays and not more. He looked at his hands. That's what I told myself. It's not a lie exactly. But it's also not the whole truth. He looked at the photographs on the shelf, by the radiator. The whole truth is that I was afraid. Hargrove has lawyers, and contacts, and the patience of a man who has never once needed to worry about consequences. I'm a superintendent. I'm one phone call from being unemployed. And now a 9-year-old boy walked into my building's lobby last Thursday asking if men with ties could take children away from their mother, Eddie said. He stood there with his coat too big for him, asking me that. He stopped. I couldn't answer him either. I was ashamed. He stood and rinsed his cup. The report to Family Services, that wasn't a concerned neighbor, that came from Hargrove's office. I heard him on the phone in the lobby when he thought the building was empty. He said the widow would have 2 problems now instead of 1, and that 2 problems was usually enough. Steve leaned back. He had it now, the full shape of it, the building with 17 units and 11 long-term tenants on below-market rates, the investor with expensive shoes, the forged amendments, the manufactured violations, and now the custody. Threat not meant to actually remove Tommy and Grace, but meant to put Ellie in a position where she had to fight 2 battles at once with 1 set of hands. Hargrove did not break people. He just made them tired enough to stop. Samuel Ortiz, Steve said. He keeps receipts? 12 years. Shoebox under his bed. He told me once that paper doesn't lie. The way people do. Eddie set his cup in the rack and picked up his keys from the hook by the door. I'll take you. He did not look like a man who had made a decision. He looked like a man who had finally stopped making a different one. What Steve did not know yet was what Eddie had just remembered. That last week, Hargrove had asked him to change the lock on apartment 7 while Ellie was at work. Eddie had not done it, but Hargrove had asked. Samuel Ortiz opened his door on the second knock. He was a solid man, square-shouldered, with close-cut gray hair and the stillness in the face that comes from seeing things that cannot be unseen. His right ear was slightly turned, the habit of a man whose hearing on that side had not been reliable for 15 years. He looked at Eddie, then at Steve. "Come in," he said. The apartment was orderly, books with their spines out, a folded American flag. In a triangle case above a framed citation, a small radio on the window ledge. Everything in its place, the apartment of a man who has decided what matters, and arranged his life accordingly. "I know who you are," Samuel said to Steve, sitting down without ceremony. "My granddaughter would be very excited. I'll tell her after this is over." Steve sat across from him. "What do you know about what's been happening in this building?" "Everything," Samuel said. "I have 2 ears. One of them works fine." He talked for nearly an hour. He talked about the fees that started appearing in February. $2, $4, labeled maintenance surcharge and administrative processing. He had complained. Hargrove had shown him a paper with his signature on it, claiming it amended his lease. "The signature wasn't mine," Samuel said. "I know my signature. I've been writing it for 58 years. He went to the bedroom and came back with a shoebox so worn its corners were held by rubber bands. He set it on the table and opened it. 12 years of receipts, original leases and renewals, letters from 3 different landlords. Every bill annotated in Samuel's careful hand, PAID, date, amount. Steve went through them. It was there, once you knew what to look for. The original lease had no administrative surcharge anywhere in it. The amendment Hargrove had produced had a different typeface in 2 critical lines. The kind of inconsistency you only see if you are looking for it and have. The original beside it. The signature was almost right. Almost. But Samuel's real signature on the original had a capital S that the amendment did not match. "You'll let me borrow these?" "Copies. The originals don't leave." Samuel looked at him. "Are Eleanor's children safe?" "They're with her right now," Steve said. Samuel nodded slowly. "Daniel was a good man. I was at the bay when they pulled him out in October. A man shouldn't die like that." He looked at the flag on the wall. "He talked about you sometimes." Steve looked up. Not by name. He talked about a young man near the docks in Los Angeles. A young man who was in trouble and had no one to speak for him. Daniel spoke for him. Samuel looked at Steve steadily. He said the man had done nothing wrong, just been in the wrong place. And everyone had already decided what kind of person he was before they looked at him. He paused. Daniel said, "It was the easiest thing he ever did, and the thing he was most glad about. He didn't make a performance of it. He just said, 'That man didn't do it, and here is what I saw.'" Samuel looked at the flag again. "I always thought it was just something Daniel said. I'm thinking now it wasn't." Steve was still for a moment, the kind of still that is not the absence of feeling but its opposite, too much arriving at once to let any of it show. He thanked Samuel, took the copies, and left. That evening he knocked on the door of apartment 7. Ellie came to the door in her work clothes, ready for the diner. She looked at him the way she looked at most things, directly and without excess. "Tommy told me he came to see you," she said. "He's a good kid. He's too serious for 9. She looked at the copies in Steve's hand. "You found something. I found the beginning of something. But there's something else." He paused. "Samuel mentioned your husband left you a letter." The composure shifted, not broken, moved. "He left an envelope," she said. "I haven't opened it. I've been..." She stopped. "I haven't been ready. You don't have to open it now." She looked at him. "But you think I should. I think it might change what you understand about why I'm still standing on this block." He said it carefully. "I don't know that. I just think it might." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she stepped back. "Come in," she said. Steve did not know what was in that envelope, but he had been thinking about what Samuel said, about a young man in Los Angeles and a dock worker who had spoken up, and something in him had been very still all evening, in the way of a man waiting to hear something he is not yet ready to hear but knows he needs to. The envelope had been in the kitchen drawer for 2 months, beneath a stack of menus, and a notepad, and 2 rubber bands that had lost their stretch. It had come back with Daniel's work bag the week after the accident, his final paycheck, the foreman's condolence card, and the envelope with Daniel's handwriting on the front. Ellie, open this when you're ready. No rush. D. She sat at the kitchen table. Steve sat across from her. Tommy was in the hallway doorway, and Ellie had not sent him back to his room because she was not certain she wanted to be alone for this. She opened it. 3 pages of Daniel Whitaker's handwriting. Careful, unhurried. The writing of a man who did not write often, and so treated each word like something that had to carry its weight. She read. The room was very quiet. Grace appeared behind Tommy at some point and leaned against his arm, her doll held flat to her chest. Ellie read the letter twice. Then she set it down and looked at Steve. He wrote this in August, she said. Her voice was steady in the way of a woman who has just received something enormous and is deciding what to do with the size of it. He was worried about the building. He had seen men from a development company in the lobby. He knew something was happening with the rent. She paused. But that's not the main part. Steve waited. He wrote about you. Steve was very still. She looked at the letter, not reading it but remembering what she just read. And then she looked at him. Years ago, he was working near the port of Los Angeles. 23, maybe. 24. There was a young man accused of stealing from a garage near the Extem docks. The young man was innocent. Daniel had seen the whole thing. Seen the real person. But the garage owner had already called the police and the young man had no one willing to speak for him. Steve looked at the table. The memory arrived the way certain memories do not gradually, but all at once. Complete. The way things are stored when you were never entirely sure you deserved them. He had been 23. Outside a garage in Los Angeles at 3 in the morning, looking for work, sleeping in a place he did not want to remember. A man who looked enough like him from behind had broken in, taken a box of tools and been seen going in but not going out. He remembered the police officer's voice, the garage owner's certainty, the way they had looked at him as if the conclusion had been drawn before the conversation started, as if his face and his clothes and the neighborhood were already the answer and the words were just a formality. He had tried to explain. He had explained clearly and calmly, and it had made no difference. He had been 23 years old, and he had understood, in a cold and specific way, that this was how it went for certain people, that there was a version of the world where your word counted, and a version where it didn't, and he was standing in the second version, and there was nothing he could do about it except wait to see how badly it went. And then, a man in a gray dock jacket, solid, quiet, unhurried, the kind of man who looks like he has places to be but is not in a hurry about any of them. He had walked up to the police officer and said, without introduction or performance, exactly what he had seen, from exactly where he had been standing, with the precision of someone who notices things and remembers them because he respects the difference between truth and assumption. The details had been specific enough that the officer had stopped. The garage owner had stopped. Steve had stood there and watched the morning change direction. He had tried to thank the man. The man had nodded once and walked back, toward the dock, as if it were simply the next thing he had to do. Steve had never known his name. Until now. Daniel went to the foreman, Ellie continued. He went to the police officer, on scene. He told them exactly what he had seen. The real person was found. The young man was let go. She looked at Steve. He said he recognized you. Years later, on a movie poster, said he recognized the eyes. Steve said nothing. He said it was one of the small things he was most glad he'd done. Not because the man became famous, because the man had needed one person to believe him. Grace was looking at Steve with the focused attention of a 6-year-old who doesn't understand the words but understands that something very important is. In the room, Tommy had moved from the doorway. He was standing behind his mother's chair, with one hand on the back of it. Ellie read the last line of the letter. A man is not what he owns. He is what he does, when nobody can repay him. The kitchen was very quiet. Steve sat with that sentence. He sat with the full weight of it. The weight of a debt he hadn't known he was carrying for 11 years. The weight of a man who had saved his future by choosing to spend 2 minutes telling the truth. The weight of understanding that the reason he had crossed the street that morning was not impulse or sympathy or some actor's instinct for the right moment. It was something older than that, something he had been pointed toward since a morning in Los Angeles when he was 23 and had nothing. He had spent years pretending not to need anyone. Daniel Whitaker had proved that one person could change the direction of a life, and now that person's family was sitting in a kitchen in North Beach in December with a landlord, trying to take everything from them. The landlord thought he was evicting a widow. He did not know he was waking up every witness he had underestimated. Did he? Ellie said quietly. Steve looked at her. Go on to do something good, she said. Steve looked at the letter on the table between them. I don't know, he said, but I'm trying to now. Tommy pressed his hand against the back of his mother's chair. Outside, the city moved on. A bus on Columbus. Mrs. Bennett's television above. The ordinary sounds of a December evening in North Beach. Inside apartment 7. Something had shifted, not dramatically, not with noise, but the way. The temperature of a room changes when enough people arrive and stay. Can I borrow the letter? Steve asked. Ellie looked at it. She looked at him. Yes, she said. Steve read Daniel Whitaker's letter 3 more times that night in his hotel room. The first time for the facts of it, the second time for the feeling, the third time because he needed to understand clearly what he was doing next, and why he was doing it, and by the third reading he did understand. 6 months of rent had bought time. The letter had bought truth. He was up before 6. There are men who operate from distance, and men who operate from presence, and Charles Renner was the first kind. He was not supposed to appear in person. Men like Renner rarely did. They made calls, signed papers, transferred funds, and allowed people like Hargrove to absorb the friction of the work. The beauty of that arrangement was that it left no visible fingerprints. Renner had done this 4 times in 3 cities, and not once had his name appeared in anything that mattered. But the McQueen problem was not going away. The neighborhood was talking. A reporter from a local paper had called Hargrove's office twice. The family services case, which should have been a pressure tool, had been assigned to a caseworker named Doyle, who had a reputation for asking the wrong questions, and Renner's contact in city administration had told him carefully that the housing office was interested in the Columbus Avenue building because a lawyer named Gaines had been seen at the records office pulling lease documents. Renner drove to North Beach on a Wednesday afternoon. He saw Steve outside the building, talking to Mrs. Bennett at the top of her steps. He parked and waited until Steve was alone on the sidewalk, walking back toward the diner. He stepped out of his car. Mr. McQueen, he said. He kept his voice warm and his distance professional. He introduced himself with the name of one of his holding companies. I wonder if I might have a word. Steve stopped walking. He looked at Renner, the shoes, the coat, the way he held himself, the practiced calm of a man whose wealth was old enough to feel like weather. 5 minutes, Steve said. Renner nodded. He spoke about the neighborhood, about investment, about the city's need to modernize aging housing stock, and what that meant for values and for the people who lived and worked here. He spoke graciously and at some length, and said nothing specific. Mr. McQueen, he said finally, I understand you've become invested in the situation at Columbus Avenue, but I want you to understand what you are seeing as a personal crisis is actually a function of a larger process. The city moves forward, neighborhoods change, people find new arrangements. He paused. You are confusing a woman's tragedy with a city's progress. Steve looked at him for a moment. Funny, he said. Men like you always call it progress when someone poorer gets erased. Renner's expression did not change. That's a compelling line. I'm sure it plays well. Hargrove's been forging lease amendments, Steve said. The signatures don't match. I have the originals. So does a lawyer who knows what he's looking at. Something moved behind Renner's eyes. Just the calculation, there and gone. I wouldn't know anything about that, Renner said. You paid for the building to be emptied, Steve said. That makes you responsible for how it's emptied. Hargrove's your method, Mr. Renner. Whatever. He did. Your name's connected to the result. Renner smiled. It was a very small smile. I think you should speak to my attorney before making statements like that. I think Tuesday night you should bring him to City Hall. Steve said. "Because Arthur Gaines will be there, so will I, so will Samuel Ortiz and his 12 years of receipts. And so will every person in that building who kept paper when Hargrove told them not to worry about the paperwork." He left Renner on the sidewalk. Renner stood very still for a moment. Then he took out a small notebook and wrote down the name Arthur Gaines. He was already recalculating, but Steve was not done for the day. He had one more meeting. Margaret Doyle had agreed to speak with him at a coffee shop on Green Street, far enough from North Beach that they were unlikely to be seen together. She arrived exactly on time, in a coat and reading glasses pushed to her forehead, and she sat down and looked at him with the frank assessment of a professional who is not impressed by celebrity and is not going to pretend. "Otherwise, I cannot discuss an open case," she said, before he could begin. "I understand," Steve said. "I'm asking hypothetically, if a case file arrived on your desk that had been constructed with a purpose not with the child's welfare in mind, but with the parents' vulnerabilities in mind, would a thorough caseworker be able to tell?" Doyle looked at him over her coffee. "Hypothetically," she said, "a thorough caseworker would look at the source of the complaint very carefully. She would look at who filed it, when, and what they stood to gain. She would look at whether the concerns described matched the reality she observed in the home." She paused. "She would also look at whether the timing of the complaint was connected to any other pressure the family was experiencing, and if the source turned out to be the same person creating the other pressure, then the file would reflect that. The documentation would be part of the daughter record." She finished her coffee and set down the cup. "There is a community development meeting Tuesday evening at City Hall, second floor, public meeting. Hargrove has requested agenda time." She looked at him. "Anyone can attend." She left. Steve sat for a while. He thought about what Doyle had said, and what she hadn't said, and the space between those things was clear enough. She had already seen what was wrong with the file. She had already begun documenting it. She had come to this meeting, and she had said exactly what she said, because she understood that the Tuesday meeting was going to matter, and she wanted someone to know that. The family services case was not going to be the weapon Hargrove intended. She was good at her job, and Hargrove had not chosen her carefully enough. What Renner could not calculate was that Hargrove had underestimated every single person in that building, and Hargrove had not just made enemies, he had made witnesses. By Tuesday, they would all be in the same room. The meeting room on the second floor of City Hall held 60 people in folding chairs, and, on Tuesday evening, closer to 80. A dozen stood along to the walls. By 8 o'clock, the room smelled of wool coats and coffee and the specific tension of a public meeting where multiple parties have arrived prepared to win different things. Hargrove and Renner sat at the front table with a property lawyer and a man from a development firm whose name appeared on Renner's company documents. Hargrove had his files. Renner had his folded hands and his middle distance stare, the expression of a man who has delegated the performance and is waiting for results. Ellie Whitaker sat in the third row. Before she had left the apartment, she had stood in the kitchen for a long moment with Daniel's letter in her hands. She had folded it and put it in her coat pocket. Tommy had been watching her from the doorway. "If that man is going to use your father's death against us," she said, "then he can hear your father's words too." Tommy had nodded. She had kissed his forehead and told him to stay with Mrs. Bennett. Now she sat in the third row in her good coat, the dark blue one she wore. To Daniel's service, with her hands in her lap and her jaw set, she had asked Mrs. Bennett to stay with the children. Mrs. Bennett's knee was bad, but she had agreed immediately. She had also handed Samuel Ortiz her full folder of documents. Samuel sat beside Ellie with the shoebox on his knees. Arthur Gaines was in the fifth row. Eddie Malloy was against the back wall with his hands in his pockets and the look of a man who has decided, finally, what kind of person he is. Margaret Doyle was near the left wall with a notepad, having attended as a professional observer of a case she was no longer sure had been filed honestly. Steve McQueen stood near the right side door, cap low, unremarkable in a crowd large enough that he had been there 20 minutes without anyone looking twice. Hargrove spoke first. He spoke well. He spoke about the North Beach neighborhood, its potential, the importance of modernizing aging housing stock, the partnership between private investment and city development. He spoke about the building on Columbus Avenue and the challenges of managing properties where long-term tenants resisted reasonable lease updates. He mentioned, carefully, concerns about building maintenance that certain residents were interfering with. He did not name Ellie, but he looked toward the third row when he spoke about tenants who had fallen behind on obligations. He was smooth. He had done this before, in different rooms, with different audiences. Then he mentioned the difficulty of tenants who brought outside parties into private contractual matters, clouding legitimate business with sentiment. He did not name Steve McQueen. He did not need to. Half the room looked at the right side door. The floor opened. A woman from the neighborhood association asked about timelines. A man behind Ellie said he had heard people were being pushed out. A younger man asked whether the investment would benefit current residents or replace them. Hargrove handled all of it, smoothly. Then he turned the floor back to himself, the way a man does when he has rehearsed the room. "I want to speak plainly," he said, with the practiced reluctance of someone performing transparency. "There has been significant public commentary about this building, about a specific situation involving one of our tenants. I think it is important to address that directly so that the people in this room can make accurate judgments." He spoke about Ellie Whitaker without naming her. He spoke about a unit in arrears, a tenant who had used personal circumstances as reason for non-payment across an extended period, whose situation had attracted outside involvement that had, in his view, complicated a straightforward contractual matter. "A family tragedy," he said, "is not a lease negotiation, and sympathy from a well-known individual does not change the financial obligations that the other 16 tenants in this building meet every month without drama." He paused. He looked at the third row. "I'm also obligated to acknowledge that concerns have been raised through the proper channels regarding the welfare of the children in that unit. It would be inappropriate for me to comment further on an open case, but it would be irresponsible not to be transparent that the building's management has had concerns about the children's supervision, about whether this family is receiving the support it actually needs, rather than the kind that makes a good photograph." The room moved. Not everyone, but some. A few exchanged glances. A woman near the back frowned. Hargrove had constructed it with care, nothing technically false, everything waited to position Ellie as someone who had used grief as a shield, used her children as a story, and accepted money from a movie star rather than face her obligations, and all of it wrapped in the language of concern. Ellie sat in the third row with her hands in her lap and felt the room shift, and recognized exactly what was happening, and hated it precisely because it was working. She had been the widow for 3 months. People were kind, people were patient, but patience has a horizon, and Hargrove had just drawn a line at it. She thought about Daniel. She thought about the letter, still in her coat pocket, folded where she had put it before leaving the apartment. She thought, if I don't speak, he tells the story, and the story he tells will not be mine. She stood. "My husband died believing this building still had decent people in it," she said. Her voice was clear and level, and it cut through the room the way quiet voices do when they are carrying something real. "I came tonight to find out if he was wrong." The room was very quiet. Hargrove opened his mouth, and Steve stepped away from the wall. He did not raise his hand. He moved through the room until he was in the aisle, and the room changed the way rooms change when they recognize someone. Hargrove saw him. The smooth expression held, but something behind it shifted. "I have a question," Steve said, addressing the room. "When you talk about tenants who've fallen behind on obligations, are you talking about the tenants? You've been charging fraudulent fees for the last 8 months. The room went quiet. "Because I have original leases and amended leases, and the signatures on the amendments don't match the signatures on the originals." "And Samuel Ortiz." He looked at Samuel, who nodded once, "has 12 years of receipts and would like someone to explain where the administrative surcharges came from, since they don't appear anywhere in his original contract." Renner looked at Hargrove. For the first time that night, Walter Hargrove stopped smiling. "These are legal matters that require context." "Arthur Gaines is here," Steve said. "He's reviewed them. He doesn't find them complicated." Gaines raised his hand from the 5th row. Hargrove looked at Gaines. He looked at Samuel and the shoebox. He looked at Ellie. He looked at Eddie Malloy against the back wall. Eddie met his eyes and stepped forward. "My name is Eddie Malloy," Eddie said. "I'm the superintendent at 412 Columbus Avenue, and I want to tell you what I saw, not what I was told to see." He talked for 7 minutes. He talked about the complaints he had been asked to ignore, maintenance requests, left unlogged, to be used later as tenant negligence, lease amendments that had arrived printed and ready, that Hargrove had called standard forms, Mrs. Bennett's hallway violation, a crack in the wall since 1959 that Eddie himself had reported to the previous owner twice, the Whitaker family, good tenants, being pushed toward the edge through manufactured debt. He talked about the phone call he had overheard in the lobby. He said the widow would have 2 problems now instead of 1, Eddie said. He said that was usually enough. The room had been quiet through most of it. Now it was very quiet. Hargrove said, "Eddie, you are making—" "I know what I'm making," Eddie said. He looked at Hargrove the way a man looks at something he has been afraid of for a long time and has finally decided is smaller than the fear. "I've been thinking about it for a while." Hargrove turned to Renner. Renner leaned toward his lawyer and said something, very quietly. Then the door in the back of the room opened. Tommy Whitaker walked in. He was wearing his coat buttoned to the collar. He had Mrs. Bennett's folder under his arm. He had heard, through a neighbor's telephone call to the apartment, that a man at City Hall was telling a room full of people that his mother was irresponsible, that she had used her husband's death as an excuse, that she had let her children go unsupervised, that she had needed a celebrity to pay her obligations. He had told Mrs. Bennett he was going to get some air. He had walked 3 blocks to City Hall. He came down the aisle with the particular deliberateness of a 9-year-old who has decided to do something and is not going to be talked out of it. The room saw him. People near the aisle stepped back slightly to let him through. Hargrove saw him. For a moment, something genuinely uncertain moved across Hargrove's face. The expression of a man who has calculated every adult in the room and has not accounted for a child. Tommy walked to the front. He stood between Steve and Ellie, facing the room. Ellie's first instinct was not pride. It was terror. He was 9 years old. He should have been home. He should have been eating soup in Mrs. Bennett's kitchen, not standing in a city room full of men who had spent the evening weighing his mother like a problem to be solved. She started to rise. Tommy shook his head, small but clear. He needed to do this. He opened Mrs. Bennett's folder and found what he was looking for. He took out Daniel Whitaker's letter. Hargrove said, "This is a public meeting for adults. My father was a tenant in this building," Tommy said. His voice was clear. It did not shake. He lived here for 6 years. He paid his rent every month. He kept a ledger. I have it at home. He held up the letter. He wrote this in August, before he died. He wrote it for my mother. I want to read one line. He found the line. "A man is not what he owns. He is what he does when nobody can repay him." He lowered the letter. He looked directly at Walter Hargrove. "You talked about my mother like she was a file," Tommy said. "She is not a file. My father paid you every month until he died. Don't call my mother a liar." The room was completely still. Hargrove's mouth was open. He closed it. Margaret Doyle, who had been writing in her notepad, stopped writing. The city housing official, who had come expecting a standard neighborhood development meeting, looked at Tommy, then at his notepad, then at the folder of documents Samuel Ortiz was holding. He opened his notepad to a fresh page. Hargrove said, and his voice had lost its polish, "This is a—" "Sit down, Mr. Hargrove," the housing official said. The room did not make a sound. Gaines stood. "I'd like to request," he said, addressing the housing official, "that the lease documents from 412 Columbus Avenue be submitted for forensic examination. I have copies of original and amended leases for 3 tenants, provided voluntarily, and I have reason to believe the amendments contain alterations not authorized by the signing parties." He paused. "I'm also prepared to file a formal complaint with the city's housing office tomorrow morning." The housing official had come expecting a standard neighborhood meeting. He opened his notebook and did not close it again. Samuel Ortiz set his shoebox on the table in front of him and opened it. 12 years of receipts, annotated in precise handwriting. The original lease. The amendment with the mismatched typeface and the almost right signature. Rosalie Bennett's folder contained 27 years of correspondence, the letters from tenants who had left, the record of a building whose long-term residents had been systematically pressured toward the door. Margaret Doyle handed the housing official a single page from her case file, the source of the complaint against Eleanor Whitaker, traced to an office, connected to Hargrove's property management company. The concern for the children, she said, was not concern for the children. Hargrove's lawyer was talking into his ear. Hargrove was looking at the room at the faces that a week ago had been invisible to him. The superintendent who had signed forms without reading them, and was now saying so. The veteran with his shoebox. The retired schoolteacher's folder. The caseworker with her file. The lawyer with the documents. And the 9-year-old boy still standing at the front of the room with his father's letter. Renner stood, quietly, without drama, the way a man stands when he is decided. The room is no longer useful to him. He began moving toward the side door. Steve said, "Leaving already, Mr. Renner? I thought this was progress." Renner stopped. He turned. He looked at Steve with the expression of a man who has decided the best response to a difficult moment is to appear above it. "I think," Renner said carefully, "that I need to speak with my attorney." "That's a good idea," Steve said. "Arthur Gaines is in the 5th row. He'd be happy to explain the documents to yours." Someone in the room laughed. Just one person, quickly, and then the room was quiet again. But it had happened. Renner sat back down. His lawyer leaned in and spoke quietly. Renner's face did not change, but his hands, which had been folded on the table for the entire meeting, moved. He put them in his lap. The housing official asked for all documents to remain available for review. He asked that no changes be made to current tenancies at 412 Columbus Avenue. Pending investigation. He used the word investigation twice and did not look at Hargrove either time, which communicated, in the particular language of public officials, more than the words did. He also asked, directly, that the source documents from Renner's development company be made available for cross-reference with the lease amendments. Renner's lawyer said they would require a formal request. The housing officials said he would have one on their desk by morning. Hargrove was looking at the room. He had spent 8 months in this building making people invisible, treating them as numbers, as inefficiencies, as obstacles between a property and its potential value. He had been very good at it. He had done it before, and he had always found that invisible people stayed invisible, that they did not organize, that they did not keep careful records, that they did not have the energy to fight back because fighting back requires resources, and he had made sure they had as few as possible. What Hargrove had not understood, what men like Hargrove almost never understand in time, is that the people you underestimate the longest are the ones who have been watching you the longest. Samuel Ortiz with his shoebox had 12 years of evidence. Rosalie Bennett with her filing cabinet had 27. Eddie Malloy had the memory of a man who had done wrong things and finally decided to say so. And Eleanor Whitaker had a letter in her coat pocket and a 9-year-old son, who was still standing at the front of the room with his father's words in his hands, looking at Hargrove the way only a child can look at an adult who has tried to erase his family, with the clear, unflinching knowledge that what happened was wrong and the complete refusal to look away from it. Hargrove's lawyer leaned in and said something quiet and final. Hargrove reached for the folder in front of him and knocked his own pen to the floor. Nobody picked it up. Hargrove's face did not move, but for the first time in the room, the expression behind it was not calculation. It was the expression of a man who has finally run out of paper. The meeting broke up after 10. People stood outside City Hall in small groups in the cold fog, talking in the low, energized voices of people who have witnessed something they will be discussing for a long time. The street lamps made the fog glow gold. Hargrove left through the side entrance. Renner's car appeared at the curb and took him away. Ellie stood on the steps with Samuel and Gaines, talking about next steps. The formal complaint, the forensic examination, the legal question of back charges for the fraudulent fees. Gaines was careful and clear. It would take time, but the foundation was real and the documentation was solid. Steve came down the steps and stood beside her. Margaret Doyle caught Ellie's eye from across the plaza. A small, professional nod. The nod of a caseworker who had seen enough. "The case file?" Ellie said. "She'll close it," Steve said. The complaint came from Hargrove's office. "She has it documented." Ellie exhaled. It was not dramatic. It was the breath of a woman who has been holding something very tightly for a long time and has just, for a moment, been allowed to stop. Samuel shook Steve's hand with both of his. Tommy was beside his mother, and when Ellie put her arm around his shoulder, he leaned against her with the specific relief of a boy who has done something very hard and is now very tired. Eddie Malloy was still inside. Steve found him in the hallway off the main room, sitting in a folding chair. With his coat on his lap, he looked like a man who had used everything he had. "You going to be all right?" Steve said. "I'll need different work," Eddie said. "You'll have it." Gaines had already made a call. There was a property management firm in Oakland with several buildings and a need for a superintendent with 9 years of experience and the kind of integrity that shows up when it matters most. Eddie put on his coat. "Mr. McQueen," he said. "I should have done this sooner." "You did it when you could," Steve said. "That's when it counts." Outside, Ellie walked home along Columbus Avenue with Tommy and Grace. Grace had appeared with Mrs. Bennett, who had brought her when Tommy called from the payphone down the street to say things were going well. They walked back toward the building in the December cold, Grace holding Ellie's hand. With her doll under her arm, Tommy walking half a step ahead the way he always did, keeping watch. Ellie unlocked apartment 7 and opened the door. The apartment was exactly as they had left it. The kitchen light was on. Daniel's tools were on the shelf where Eddie had set them when he carried the box back up. The letter was on the table. Grace walked in and looked around. "Are we staying?" she asked. "Yes, baby," Ellie said. "We're staying." She stood in the doorway for a moment with both children inside and the door open and the cold air at her back, and then something in her let go quietly, without drama, the way things let go when they have been held very tightly for a very long time. Not collapse, just release. The way a breath comes out when you have been holding it without knowing. She closed the door. Outside on Columbus Avenue, Steve stood by the rented Ford for a moment, looking up at the light in the window of apartment 7. He watched it for a while. Then he got in the car and pointed it south. He drove. He drove Highway 1 because he wanted the coast, and the Pacific was good for this, for moving through distance that is larger than the thing you are carrying. He thought about Daniel Whitaker in a gray dock jacket on a morning in Los Angeles, choosing to tell the truth for a young man he did not know for no reason except that it was true, and the young man needed someone to say it. He thought about Tommy standing at the front of that room with his father's letter, 9 years old, his voice clear, looking directly at the man who had tried to call his mother a liar. He thought about Ellie, who had held her family together with a waitress salary and grief, and the quiet iron of a woman who will not let herself be made small in front of her children. He thought, 6 months of rent bought time. The letter bought truth. Then he got back in the car and drove south, and the headlights made the road real again, yard by yard, the way the road is always made real, one piece at a time, as far as you can see, and then a little further. Weeks later, Gaines called from San Francisco. The forensic examination had confirmed lease alterations in 2 of the 3 documents examined. A formal housing complaint had been filed. Hargrove was under investigation. Renner's development company had withdrawn its interest in the Columbus Avenue property. Eddie Malloy had started at the Oakland firm. The fraudulent fees had been rolled back. Every tenant at 412 Columbus Avenue had received a formal correction. Eleanor Whitaker's case file had been closed. Gaines passed along a note from Ellie. Tommy had developed an interest in law. Steve read the note twice. He folded it and put it in his jacket pocket. It stayed there for years, not because it reminded him of what he had done, because it reminded him of what Daniel Whitaker had done first. Some men become heroes on a screen, others become heroes on a sidewalk. Before anyone starts clapping,